I think it's impossible to argue that they don't have a heavy influence in our collapsing of ourselves within our own country. But yeah, I think like if we can't manage to get along better than we do, there is no hope for the country in the long term. It just to me there's no scenario that exists where things continue to go the way that they're going, and we have an ability to crawl out of the hole we've found ourselves in and get back to the top the way we were 30 years ago.
How do we maybe start acting normal around each other again? What's the pathway of that?
To me, it starts with each individual, setting the example and being the example. If everybody lived their life like Joe Rogan said on like somebody's following them around with a camera and it's being broadcasted, I think until people do that, you really can't do it, because you can't expect other people to do things you're not willing to do. If you're not willing to hold yourself accountable and do the things that you expect everybody else to do, then nobody's going to do them.
Right.
And so it starts with that. There's a host of other things which I'm happy to kind of go down list-wise. I think the nuclear family needs to be brought back to the forefront of being the predominant dynamic in the overwhelming majority of American households. There's too much data that says the positive benefits that are gained by having a nuclear household in a traditional American fashion that are positive and got us to that point. Because when that's broken down and kids are now learning from classmates and from the internet and school and the bigger influences outside the home, then the forming of them as human beings and members of society are incredibly easy to manipulate. They're super malleable, and then they're there for the taking by whoever wants it, And I think we've seen over the last decade plus that there are a lot of nefarious people that want our country to collapse that have taken a high vested interest in doing that and have been overwhelmingly successful in doing so. Fixing the government from the influence standpoint and term limits, and having a government that actually represents the people is a necessity for that to happen. And to get more kind of in the weeds, I think, to me, it's pretty obvious that manufacturing needs to go back to the 1990 and before level of,
like before TPP kind of deal.
Yeah. There are too many scenarios that exist where when it's not the case, doesn't matter what we think, doesn't matter what we want, doesn't matter what we do. If you don't have the ability to make most of the things that your society depends on, everybody else who does make those things have you by the balls. There's no way around that. And we've outsourced so many things, not just to China, but outside the U.S. to where if the entire collective world wanted to just completely destroy us, I think they could through economic means. They wouldn't have to do even cyber warfare. I mean, they could just say, we're not selling you guys anything. And I think the only reason that they haven't is because their economies rely too heavily on us for now. But I do think that sooner than later there will come a point where they can handle not relying on us buying so many things from them, and ultimately will. And I think, when you combine all those things together, it's a recipe for failure. So I think we need to fix all of those things.
All right, I want to come back to the cyber warfare aspect, so we'll put a pin in that. But you had a few points there. The first one being the nuclear family. When that idea was formed, if we're just looking at this on a level, people's life expectancies were lower, right? And there were the populations were smaller and things like that. And it's not like excusing how people look at it today. But now, for some people I talk to, they're like, okay, you marry a girl at 28, you might live to 120. you don't know how you're going to feel at 50. And people do get divorced. I believe, and I can cut this if you don't want to talk about this, but like you got divorced once as well, right?
Yeah.
So you're speaking at this from both angles of it as well. Like maybe the way I should start this is like, do you look back on your situation, and obviously like you seem to have handled it well and have a close relationship with your kids and everything seems to be fine, but do you look at how that could have gone wrong because, you know, you and your wife didn't end up being together, and you're like, I see how the percentages play out where a lot of kids do get fucked up from this? Is that kind of how you look at it?
That's for sure part of it. I think it kind of boils down to, I would say, statistics, really, in a way, and that to say that, you know, having a nuclear family is a recipe for success and there's no way for that to go wrong. I'm not saying that. I'm also not saying that, you know, you can't get divorced and still co-parent and raise, you know, healthy, productive, positive, mentally healthy children. What I think, you know, looking at the broad spectrum is that in your percentage chance, your highest percentage chance for producing productive members of society is to have the overwhelming majority nuclear families. It's not a guarantee. It's not a guarantee that if you are, they're going to be great. It's not a guarantee if you're not, that they're not going to be great. But the stats don't lie that, you know, there are fewer nuclear families. And I think that from an influence standpoint, your kids, especially when they're really young, need that. To your point, agreed, like when you're 20 and 80, you're going to be very different. You're going to be very different when you're 30 than you are when you're 20.
Right.
Every 10 years, you know, I think you change, most people change quite a bit. I think the key window of opportunity is that childbirth to, you know, teen years, where, you know, when that window is closed, I'm not going to say it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter nearly as much. You know, so kids coming from, you know, when, especially in that first 5 or 6 years before they go to school, and now they're spending more time with other people than they are their actual immediate family, that window in particular is crucial. You know, and I think to pinpoint a mechanism that says, hey, statistically, when there are more families that are having kids, and when those kids are in their formidable years, their family is together, that's going to set us up for success more than the opposite of that.
Yeah, and I think you're also pointing out it's more, when you say nuclear family, it's more than just like, oh, are your parents together and whatever. It's like, what are they doing too?
Right.
What kind of example are they setting?
For sure.
When you're at the dinner table, if you are even at the dinner table together, is everyone like this, or are people actually talking? Are there principals in the household? How do they parent? What's the relationship between parent and child? You've mentioned throughout this conversation today about like the coddling of society and things like that. And you are pointing to a societal wide, obviously not everyone, but a larger percentage wise problem of like coddling that goes on in the parent-child relationship as well.
For sure. You know, and again, I'll credit my parents in, to me, setting a really, really good example of how to kind of walk that fine line of supportive but not coddling. You know, they were hard when they needed to be hard. They were nurturing when they needed to be nurturing, supportive when they needed to be, and you know, at the end of the day, like we all always knew that they loved us and supported us, and they set a really good example. Do you have to be married for that to happen? No, and maybe the better term is not necessarily a nuclear family or redefining the dynamic is having two involved parents that are playing those specific roles in their children's lives for the entirety of their childhood. You know, do you have to be married for that to happen? No. Does it make it easier? Absolutely it does. Are there fucked up families where their parents are still together? Yes. Are there great families where their parents never even got married? Also yes. But again, to paint it with kind of a broad stroke, and again, maybe the nuance or the important thing to highlight is that when kids are growing up, they have the masculine and feminine roles in their lives in an appropriate way where they're setting the tone in both of those arenas, and they're contrasting and contributing to each other kind of the way nature, I think, intended.
Yeah, I agree completely. And you're talking about, again, like the percentage play on society, which is then what you see play out overall. And you're 100% right. So I hope that in this era, as a part of like turning some things around, that is something people focus on more, because I think when you look at the last 20 years with all the wars, the economic downturn, the broken homes as a result of that, the lack of hope, that's how you have young kids turn to like hardcore wokeism or stuff like that. And now, if there's a positive right now, I think there's been a little bit of a reset on that, where people are like, all right, wait a minute, what the fuck were we talking about here? And hopefully one of the downstream effects is that some of these like actual civilizational wide values, like a nuclear family, actually take precedent again.
Yeah. And I want to, I guess, highlight one other aspect is that, within the kind of the realm of that nuclear family, when you have, kids that are growing up and they're influenced by, two parents that, are again setting that example. A typical argument you hear, and you kind of brought this up early on in the discussion, was the lack of opportunity. I'd say one of the first counter arguments you'll hear to what I just said is, dude, you can't live nowadays, right, where both parents aren't working. Again, there's comparisons that people will make to the way things are now, the way, compared to the way things were, let's say in the 1950s, where it was kind of peak nuclear family in this country from an American culture standpoint. I do think it's also important to look at the standard of living, is that look at the standard of living of people in the 1950s, and it's like a lot of families, most families, the husband went to work, the wife stayed home with the kids. They also didn't have 5 TVs and 4 cars and a 4,500 square foot house and an expectation to DoorDash 90% of their food, to Amazon and to Netflix. There's a lot of things that we take for granted and assume that from a standard of living standpoint are the necessities that absolutely are not. That back then they had none of those things, and so when kids grow up, again, being spoiled and coddled and given everything, and now they enter, they're 20 years old living on their own, and they still expect to drive a $70,000 car and live in a nice house and have the latest smartphone and be able to, stream whatever they want and have the latest laptop and have their own vehicle, all of these things. It's like, well, yeah, you can't live the way your parents had lifestyle-wise while you were growing up the second you enter the real world. If you have that as an expectation, no, that's never going to exist. That didn't exist back then, in terms of as soon as you left the house that you're now living to the same standard of living that your parents did. So I do think, a little bit of reframing the perspective on what's necessity versus not is also a crucial part of that argument. Even entertaining the possibility of having, the predominant dynamic in American households be the nuclear family.
For sure. Yeah, there's a lot there to unpack. First off, the point about, the commonality being both parents having full-time jobs now to be able to get by is something we got to work on in society as well. And, for my future wife, whoever she's going to be, I want her to do what she wants to do.
God bless her.
Right? Yeah, I know.
That poor woman.
They call that a life sentence. But, I'm going to want her to do what she wants to do. If she wants to have a career, I want her to be able to do that. But I also want to have a bunch of kids, and I'm going to have to get someone on board who wants that too. And I would also like her to have, I work so hard now because I would like her to be able to have the opportunity to be home with those kids. That's something I was very lucky on. My mom had a great job and left it behind to raise me because that's what she wanted. Okay, so you understand that's what she wanted, and I think that turned out amazing for me. And not everyone in this country, a lot of people in this country don't have that opportunity. Their parents don't have that opportunity to do that, and I'd like to create that. But also to the point of success and how you pass that down. It's also interesting hearing you talk about it because you're a very successful guy and you have kids, and obviously you've raised them well and they're going out in the world and going to start doing their thing at some point, and you've had this at the top of mind. But in my old career on Wall Street, not to say every example I saw was bad, I saw some good examples too, but I saw many examples of people who would be clients who, are worth hundreds of millions of dollars and their kids are dead. They're dead. They never had a shot. because they grew up with, like you said, 4 cars, whatever they wanted, and just had this built-in entitlement as to how the world works. And then even worse, they all had these fucking trust funds, which I think I think it's like dripping poison into a kid, so that, you know, when they got out there and they were fucking around doing whatever, well, they always had this to fall back on and go spend their money and pretend it was theirs, that, you know, they were putting everyone else on, and really they're just miserable because they lack that purpose and they know it's not theirs. And I actually felt bad for that. And that's something like, I'm in a career where if I end up getting a lot of success here, and I plan to, yeah, a lot of money will come with that at some point. And even as someone who's not a father right now, that is something I already actively think about, because I don't want my kids thinking about any of that. I don't want them assuming they're going to get any of it. I don't intend to set up fucking trust funds for them and shit. Like, I want my kids to fucking go make their own way and make something of themselves in the world. And part of that also is like, I'm going to have to find a woman who's okay with this. I have zero interest in fucking 15-room mansions and shit like that. It's not to say like I don't like a nice thing once in a while. I like having a nice laptop and shit like that. But like, I'm not going to sit here and go spend on this, and that. And I damn well don't want my kids having that expectation around them, because I think what they see is what they expect in the world. And if you're growing up, you know, in fucking silk pajamas in some mansion with a maid, it's like, well, how can you ever expect that person to go out and do something? You even used the example earlier of like Rocky IV, where he had to put himself back in the cold, you know, to be able to do it. There's the old Hagler quote, prize fighter, where he's like, it's really hard to get up and train for a fight when you're at 4 a.m. when you're sleeping in silk pajamas.
Yeah.
That is something I think you have to think about, especially if you're like coming into success, about how you're going to instill the right values in their kids so they can, you know, actually selfishly for them, go make their own way, you know?
Yeah. I mean, to me, the answer is really simple. It's not easy. You know, most parents, especially if they didn't come from a lot, now find themselves successful. They've got young families. You hear this a lot. I want for my kids what I didn't have. That's a dangerous proposition most of the time. It's not to say that you want, you know, the same level of struggle, especially, you know, some super successful people came from just god-awful childhoods. It's not to say that you want to put that on them. To me, the simple answer, and not easy one, is that you use the same level of meticulous intentionality and strategic planning that you did to get to where you are professionally, with raising your children in a way where they're not going to turn into that entitled asshole. It's not an easy thing to do. But what that means and what that looks like or translates to is thinking about things before they get them, saying, hey, you can have this, but not that. You're going to have to work for this. If you break it or lose it, you don't get another one. You know, and you're constantly navigating those decisions, having to evolve your perspective as they get older, and you're going to fuck up. I mean, realize like you're going to make some of the wrong decisions. The key is identify when you made the wrong decision and do your damnedest not to make that mistake again. But you have to put the same level of effort into ensuring that doesn't happen as you did making sure and ensuring that it did happen for you. And to me, that's the way you get around it or you navigate it.
It's a great way to put it. I think it's also one of those things like you have to do it and experience it to kind of figure out what it is. There's parts I can mentally prepare myself, but like I'm not going to know till I'm in it. Yeah,
and you'll get thrown curveballs, you know, because that's where emotion comes in. You know, as a father, especially, you have daughters who bat their eyelashes and know how to pull your strings and what have you. You know, it can be tough sometimes to dish out a little bit of tough love and lesson learning. You know,
right.
You need to go slap your guy around again.
We're doing all right. Let's take a quick break. We're gonna let them drill for a minute. We'll be right back. All right, we're back. Yeah, actually, I saw. Can you move a little this way? Sorry, I saw. What's it called? Chris Cuomo in action doing that behind the scenes when I was over visiting my friend Nishan at News Nation, and that skill of like, oh, you come back from a commercial break and you go, oh, so, and you just rattle off like.
It's a skill.
That's what I'm saying. Like he would be talking like with a producer, not about the show, like shooting the shit on something. And then suddenly they wouldn't even do a countdown. It would just be like a silent 3, 2, 1. Be like, yeah, no, totally. Hi, welcome back to News Nation. I'm Chris Quan. I was like, and he would just go into this whole thing, and he's not reading anything. I was like, wow, a lot of repetition in that.
Yeah, well, to me, there's a same level of skill with actors being able to do that. You know, like they'll be doing some really depressing or heavy emotional scene, and it's like it wraps, and then they finish telling some stupid like joke to you know 5 of the cast members or whatever, and you know they're all laughing or whatever, and then it's like, all right, do it again, and then they just whoosh, you know, and they're right back into it's like, I mean, especially in that lane, I think it's almost like psychotic, you know, like sociopathic that you can be that convincing to that disparity on polar opposite sides of the emotional spectrum and just fucking turn on a dime like that. Like there's almost like, man, what's wrong with you to be able to do that?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. I've heard both ends of that spectrum. There's that where you have, I can't think of examples right now, but there are a lot of actors who are just like that and able to do that. And then there's the polar other end, which is also like a form of like psychotic nature where you have like Daniel Day-Lewis who does not get out of character for like 6 months in a character.
Well, I heard that, going back to Dark Knight, that Heath Ledger, that was a struggle of his, is that he was like so into that character that he was like troubled by it, you know.
It killed him.
Yeah.